As the devil worm would infiltrate the bodies of presumably most of the human race located within North and South America, as well as any outlying island nations surrounding the continent, droves of humanity would fall, but then get back up again and start infecting others. The working theory is that the saltwater shocks the worm's system to the point that the infection may not have spread to the other portions of planet Earth yet, but the North and South American continents completely are inundated by the infected. This began to have some fairly strange effects on those who were infected for extended periods of time, resulting in creatures known as the special ridden. The special ridden are those who likely have a genetic variability brought on against the original host's DNA, which ultimately resulted in different outcomes. For most who were infected, just as a quick rundown, it would appear that once nutrients ran scarce, that being humans, they would congregate into areas and then devolve into cancerous masses. These masses would then go on to not only help fuel the remaining horde of common ridden, but also end up building other variants who were capable of ransacking human settlements, as their purpose seemed to quite literally be to just overcome the still fighting species on the planet. Other infected who appeared possibly to be able to deal with these genetic changes and had some marker within their genes would be selected by the worm for something else, forming these new special ridden either by existing within the flesh piles or by growing the new body parts. Again, these special ridden would fan out to attempt to locate and convert the last remaining humans. Now, whether that was by changing those who were just lucky enough to have avoided the devil worms thus far, or by destroying those who appear to be immune, it really wouldn't matter. So in today's episode, we'll be focusing in on the specific special variant known as the stinger. I think the best way to do this, so that we actually can spend the time necessary to understand their physiology as well as how they ended up this way, is to cover the subvariant of the families separately. So for instance, in the stinger family, there are stingers, stalkers, and hawkers. Today we'll be focused in on just what the stinger is and why it is different from the other forms of infected, how it got this way, and what sort of genetics may be at play in order for this addition of new limbs to be grown. Also, I wasn't aware, a lot of people didn't know this, but I do have a Discord, and there's like 3,000 people in there, so if you guys are interested, links in the description. And I'm also streaming again on Roanoke Games on YouTube and under the same name on the Purple channel. And also Roanoke Tales is back after a 3-month hiatus. All right, let's keep going. So just as a refresher, as it's been a few weeks, the general running idea with the devil worm is that they are completely alien in nature. Having landed on this planet from presumably another world with a highly elliptical orbit necessitating the need to actually hibernate, as when they're surrounded by ice, they would be released on this world after a team found them in the Pingalat crater and then put water on them. Upon doing so, they became quickly familiar with the human anatomy, but with that said, however, due to all the other missing animals on this planet, it's safe to say that everything is seen as biomass, and no creature with a substantial enough mass to be broken down is safe from the worm's devouring hunger. Once entering the body, they definitely appear to have the ability to inspire certain gene expressions and restart long since deactivated gene loci, and this can have some pretty profound impacts on the human form. In most, it would never progress past their physical standard morphology until starvation began to set in and their bodies were run ragged from being driven by the devil worm. Then they would go on to meet their end in the flesh piles. With today's variant, however, getting a good look at their physiology, we can see that several areas of the body would be overhauled and the growth process would be restarted in order to form entirely new limbs, which may seem pretty odd actually, but if you consider how they formed in the first place, this is something as simple as forcing a gene expression of a specific area within our DNA, or actually really several areas of our DNA, which we will absolutely discuss because cellular regeneration is something that I'm actually pretty highly interested in. But before getting into the internals of the stinger variant of the special ridden, I think the first place we should start is with the outward morphology in order to give us a good understanding of what's happening underneath the surface level. So say the line, Roanoke. Starting with the feet, we see that actually not much has changed in this area, which is interesting considering the stark contrast between the upper and lower body, but likely this would be due to the fact that the legs themselves were already strong enough to get done with what the stinger really needed to be doing, which is hunt down cleaners and any remaining humans left in the general vicinity. Moving up further on the body, the legs will remain the same, if not maybe a little longer than average, indicating that there may have been some bone growth that have taken place in the body, but we will get back to this portion of the body when we talk about the internals and what has taken place within the body in order for it to appear the way it has. The pants of this person and what they're wearing are also fairly tattered, likely hinting at the person having been infected for quite some time. But what we don't see is any of the material being covered by blood or really by anything that would hint that it was a part of the flesh pit. This means that in some special ridden subgroups, the body itself is the only point that mutates and has done so without having needed to be changed or shaped by the flesh pit. So essentially this means the stinger is 100% homegrown based on its own genetics and ability to acquire nutrition. Moving up to the abdominal area, we see the skin has become quite discolored. The integument system overall has been compromised, likely leading to the end of many skin cells or the complete altering of blood vessels underneath the surface. The deoxygenation is really just a lack of enough oxygen reaching the skin, and this gives it the ashen gray and bluish appearance. However, because it isn't sloughing away off the body, this means that it still is alive at its dermal layers, but it may just not be doing so hot. The abdomen also appears to be more sucked into the muscle. Much like the rest of the common ridden, who appear emaciated to some degree, this indicates starvation was likely setting in for the special ridden as well, which may have necessitated the changes that we see in its physiology. Moving further up to the thoracic area is where we start getting to that good morphology, which now that I say that out loud, it sounds really not that good. Anyways, center of the chest is where the sternum typically is located on people not completely ransacked by a devil worm. We see a large sac in this area. Likely the sternum would have been broken down at this point in order for the body to actually have this area exposed as such. Judging by how it looks and its structuring, I would go on a limb to say that the stomach and esophagus have been pulled up into the neck area as well as into the upper portions of the chest, which we will get into further detail here shortly when we get to the internal structuring. Now we get to the most apparent change of the body, the forearms. The structuring would indicate that another shoulder girdle has essentially been placed on top of the other shoulder girdle. And also, shoulder girdle is really hard to say like 3 times fast. Anyhow, this would have to be the case for a few reasons. The first reason is the smaller original arms of this woman are still quite functional and do help her move and interact with the world around her. For this to properly happen, the shoulder joints would still need to remain intact along with the muscles being in the same configuration. The second reason why this is essentially an outcropping of another shoulder girdle is because the top one still has a lot of the same functionality as the original arms and shoulders. However, it is more powerful and the arms are longer. Moving on to the original arms, these are the original arms of this person. While the upper arms are much larger and it would have been easier to work with what was already there and grow them in size and then grow smaller arms, much like what we've seen in Dead Space necromorphs, growing little miniature arms around the abdominal area, this is not the same here. The smaller arms are pushed forward closer together because the sternum is no longer there in any great capacity and the rib cage has likely been stripped away in order for the central sac to protrude. The upper arms are much longer and completely new. They are about 1.5 times the size in terms of length, but also have a few other adaptations. The skin is much harder than that of the original humans, which again indicates that these are actually newly grown as they have been influenced by the activity of the worms, and the muscle mass is also higher in these arms. This makes them able to move onto vertical surfaces and hold onto structures while hunting, but also attack people and pin them down even if they are larger. This adaptation would have been critical for its success, as in being a female due to sexual dimorphism, less muscle mass is usually the standard, at least amongst females compared to males. However, with the larger upper limbs, now likely stronger than that of your average male, this would level the playing field, allowing them to bring all sides of the Homo sapiens race into the devil worm fold. On both pairs of arms, they possess 5 fingers, but on the original arms, the fingernails have continued to grow as well, and this can be used for slashing. But on the upper arms, this has increased in length, like the actual fingers are longer, as well as the nails, making them more exceptional at slashing. Moving around to the back, we see that this infected has a collection of musculature and worms mixed in. We are beginning to see that some worms in some capacity may actually act as a second form of muscle when they become adapted to the host. And the second pair of arms are controlled by the worms and not just via brain manipulation, but might also actually be tugging and pulling via the worms. Again, like a literal puppet. Then finally, getting to the head of this creature, we see several things have happened to benefit the worm, but completely screwed with the human physiology. The first thing is the missing jaw of this person. The mandible has fallen away or may likely have just been destroyed. The stinger produces acid that it uses to fire at people, well, acidic mucus anyways. This may temporarily disorientate them, making them much more of an easy target. Over time, this acid production may have melted away the large portion of the jaw and mouth, but considering the structuring of the throat and the fact that it is still there, this may indicate that the hyoid bone, the small U-shaped bone in the middle of your neck, is still there. And if you didn't know, you actually do. You have a free-floating bone. It's the only free-floating bone in your body, in your neck, behind the base of your tongue, and it actually gives support to your tongue so that you can talk. But we also see protrusions of sharp bone around the neck, likely giving stabilization for the acid to be fired from. We see adaptations like this as with the cartilage rings that keep our trachea open. The reason is that the trachea never needs to close as we are constantly breathing. The esophagus, however, on a normal person does close when not being used, and considering this creature is likely using its esophagus more often, the bones may have grown to actually keep it open and allow for easier firing of the acid. The mouth is also lined with razor-sharp teeth, but these are actually just bony growths once more, as the original teeth have long since melted away. And that's what leads me to believe that the mandible didn't just fall away, but was probably melted away. Moving up to the head, we see that hair loss is extremely pronounced, but there is some hair still there. But there is likely a reason for this. We have seen in some infected that they have resin tubes exiting outside the skin on their heads and arms, or really just overall their whole body. The same reason may be why there are holes in the head of the stinger. These are essentially air tubes and feeding tubes as as well. It is suggested that because the digestive system of the stinger is currently engaged with the acid production, it does not eat. Likely, it may return and link up to flesh piles to a degree as the worms feed through these holes in order to survive. The eyes of this creature are also like the standard infected. They glow yellow with the same bioluminescence, but to a decreased degree, with the pupils having turned yellow. What's interesting is this may actually indicate that it does have some sort of tapetum lucidum having formed, allowing it to see better in the dark when hunting. So with its outward physiology covered, we could tell there's a few things going on internally that would create this monstrosity. The first one being, out of all the other specific infected, they are either a combination of other bodies cobbled together or are quite literally just bone growth. The stinger family, however, are something special. Rather than be made from others in order to grow limbs, the worms have to work on what's already available concerning biomass and internal systems within the naturally occurring meat suit of a person. So let's take a look at what was going on, which will explain what we see in other areas of the body as well. So let's start with the most obvious adaptation, which will explain almost in a cascading way why there exists other forms of changes. The extra set of arms are kind of hard to ignore, am I right? These arms are completely and genetically related to only this person, which is actually kind of a cool concept. For this to happen, however, the worms would have had to have influence over specific cells around the shoulder blades of this person. Now, the smaller arms, being the original arms, are then pushed forward, allowing the second pair of arms to form near the upper scapula or shoulder blades, and then utilize the muscles in the trapezius area. Think of the muscles around the back of your neck now forming into actual deltoids of these new shoulders. The thing about this muscle is it can also be fairly strong. So for this to form like we have seen, then specific gene sequences for limb formation that usually take place during our embryonic form would need to be switched on. We like to think during our formation that whatever originally formed us was the influence of the womb, right? But the genes themselves are what build us, as these are just instructions being carried out. After the formation, however, these genes are switched off and have several factors that prevent them from switching back on, which is definitely to our advantage. In fact, in a previous video for Back for Blood, I believe, I think I talked about regeneration of limbs being a possibility, as we may have located these specific gene sequences for regrowing limbs. So I won't rehash all that back out, but with this arm growth, specific areas of several chromosomes must be activated. Now, you might guess this is a highly complex process involving several areas of the genetic coding, which has a high specificity for the production of a limb. So without going quite literally into a dissertation about limb formation, I'll just give you the spark notes. Limb growth is known to involve HOX and T-box genes. HOX A cluster exists on chromosome 7, HOX B is on chromosome 17, HOX C is on chromosome 12, and HOX D is on chromosome 2. Once activated in the correct order, along with the T-box 5 and 4, which activates fibroblast growth factor in the forelimb and hind limbs respectively, this can begin to essentially build a column of pseudo-stratified epithelium, or basically a bud. Over time, this bud continues to grow and stratify, which will become parts of the limb such as bone, muscle, blood vessels, and the integument system. While this is taking place, as the budding limbs continue to grow, essentially our old pal the osteoblasts and osteoclasts come into play. I mean, you knew it was going to happen. We're talking about bone growth. And this is critical to the production of these new limbs. So now we're moving back over into specifically the stinger, but the osteoclast will break down bone and put calcium back into the bloodstream, and I would imagine what it's likely working on is the collarbone's original location as well as the rib cage. This would allow for the sac to protrude through the chest sternum as it's pretty much dissolved away and the ribs are pulled back. And this is also why this is an incredibly weak area. This would also allow for the arms to come forward but maintain their functionality. This surge of calcium in the bloodstream would then begin to move into the protolimbs and new shoulder girdle, forming on the back where the new bones would begin to grow. We see the osteoblast activity, which takes calcium out of the bloodstream and affixes it to bones, increasing its durability and strength. This bone growth is in many areas, such as the esophagus, but most pronounced in the limbs themselves. Not only are the new limbs grown, which is hypothesized to be stronger than the original limbs, which means the bone would also be thicker, but also in the lower limbs as well. Once the osteoblasts are mobilized in the body under the instruction of the worms, affecting the genetic directions of the body, they would move into areas like the femur, tibia, and fibula to make the bones here more bolstered as well. This would be important as the creature needs to essentially jump from heights that would snap a normal human's leg in a heartbeat. The upper limbs also contain new muscles, but would also appear to contain the worms pulling in certain areas. If we take a look at the back between the shoulder blades, we see a collection of these worms as well as muscle growth. The worms appear to have a direct line to the function of these arms, and considering we see another worm continue up and through the back of the neck into the brainstem area, we can almost deduce that the worms of the brain may communicate through this worm as well, and then from there to the collection area, helping to utilize these new arms. Now, likely nerve formation has taken place in these new arms, judging by the surrounding circumstances, but it's safe to say that the worms do have more control over this area, with the brain having the original connection to the naturally occurring arms. However, again, considering they are the ridden, the brain really isn't so much in control of these arms either. It's really the worms that are using the brain to control these arms, meaning that they have to be able to interface, which means it is possible that they're able to interface with one another. Other internal areas may have been overhauled as well, the stomach and esophagus being the main area. Taking into consideration that the devil worm can inspire muscular growth by controlling cellular activity and likely human growth factors and the secretion of it within the brain and body, I would suspect that muscle around this sac has been made more capable of stronger contractions. Essentially, I believe that the stomach has been yanked up by the contraction of the esophagus, and while this was happening, the esophagus diameter was greatly increased. Having the stomach up higher and a shorter but wider esophagus, as shown by the neck diameter increasing, this would allow the muscle to forcibly contract around the stomach, squeezing out the stomach acid, and this would enter the esophagus and then shoot out of the mouth for fairly great distances. So you may be tempted to think that this is actually the diaphragm muscle, but I would have to say I think it's something likened to a hiatal hernia. A hiatal hernia is when the stomach can actually be yanked up through the diaphragm, which is very unpleasant. It can cause indigestion and a fair amount of pain. I believe that as the esophagus contracted and pulled everything through and then out. The diaphragm is still there, helping the creature draw in air so it can survive, but the process seems to have been somewhat compromised, which has resulted in the ashen skin that we see, as oxygen deprivation appears to be prevalent through the body. This is probably because the stomach is now sitting between the lungs, squishing them. The stomach has also been said to contain a type of mucus that is acidic, which is easily explainable. Your stomach cells are naturally protected by a coat of mucus at all times in order to stop them from being digested by the acid that they produce. When this mucus is worn thin, or the cells that produce it are damaged, this can result in things like ulcers. In my mind, much like how the stomach cells can replace esophageal cells in the body over time due to acid reflux, which is actually not good at all, by the way, likely a lot of the esophageal cells have been replaced to produce more acid and mucus. Then this creature is able to violently contract the stomach and lower esophagus. The mucus is mixed with the acid and sent flying out, causing cleaners to become prey, as it either holds them down concerning other stinger variants or can damage them due to strong acid being put all over their body after the impact. The bone growth is also seen readily within the mouth of the stinger. Having razor-sharp needles, it's apparent its original teeth are long since gone, and this also shows the osteoblast activity within the upper body has been operational for quite some time. This may indicate that as the infected continues to receive nutrients, the lower body may undergo some form of transformation, as the body seems to really still be in the middle of these changes to a degree, and this may be continuing as a process. That said, however, an extra set of legs may not be necessary, as the lower limbs are already being bolstered to handle the stressors that are being imposed upon them. Within the head of this creature, we have talked about the devil worm's influence over the mind and the absolute control it has. The cerebrum is long since gone. If this person didn't have worms controlling them, they would essentially be in a vegetative state due to the brainstem and lower brain still functioning, but the cerebrum being gone. The worm can control the body and does so quite effectively when the body is in this state. But these worms in the brain appear that they may be more important than other worms elsewhere. They have direct lines to the outside of the skin. They may have actually eaten through the skull and come out when bodies drop or in flesh piles in order to take in nutrients. The host body is no longer able to take in nutrients from what we have seen, as the systems that did that are used for a whole new purpose, so this would mean that likely the method that the worms keep themselves and the body alive is through the head. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the actual intelligence shown within this special variant. It's clear that this was concerning to the cleaners, as this infected chooses to stay back and stay out of the line of fire when it comes to its hunting patterns. Now, creatures all over the world have different methods of hunting when it comes to being a predator, but this was strange to see in the worms themselves, as the typical pattern was to run at the food and attack. This may indicate that there are different variants of this worm at play. As they become more adapted to the human body, perhaps specific portions of the brain were spared for what was represented concerning knowledge. It may also be possible that the worms specialized and took up new roles within the body. This could explain why the collection of worms between the shoulder blades could act as a muscular function role, whereas the ones located in the brain would be more like a worm brain. Even in the neck itself, we could see one worm in particular may be acting as an almost spinal cord, relaying information to the worms in the back. And this is an idea that will be explored when we get further into special ridden variants.